The car was traveling at no less than 60 miles per hour when it took that dangerous curve, one that must be approached at 6, no matter how well the driver knows the road by heart. That is what Sesto Lecquio said, the farmer from Cap d'Ail, who watched from his garden as the metallic green Rover P63500 disappeared over the edge of the Moyenne Corniche on September 13, 1982. He was the one who ran toward the embankment with a fire extinguisher. He was the one who put out the fire, beginning to consume the engine. He was the one who reached the overturned car first. And he was the one who told the police, and later the journalists, what he had seen when he arrived at the vehicle, that the young 17-year-old princess who was crying and asking them to call her father was on the driver's side, that the older woman, the one who lay unconscious, bleeding from her head, was trapped in the back of the car. Those two statements, the testimony of a 62-year-old farmer who wanted nothing more than to help, set off one of the most enduring and most painful controversies in the history of European monarchies in the 20th century. A question that has gone more than 40 years without an answer, the entire world accepts without reservation. Who was driving the Green Rover on the morning Grace Kelly lost her life? This is the story of that accident, of what is known, what is not known, and what will probably never be known. And it is also the story of the woman who had to live the rest of her life carrying the weight of that unanswered question. The story of Stephanie of Monaco, the princess born into the most glamorous family in Europe, who became the most misunderstood, the most punished, by a suspicion that was never proven and yet was never fully withdrawn. To understand what happened at that curve, you first have to understand who the two people in that car were. And to understand that, you have to go back almost 30 years, to the event that turned Monaco into the most photographed fairy tale of the century. Grace Patricia Kelly was born in Philadelphia on November 12, 1929, into a family that had built its fortune through the effort and ambition of the Irish working class. Her father, John B. Kelly, was an Olympic rowing champion who had won 3 gold medals at the 1920 and 1924 Games and had gone on to become an enormously successful construction businessman during the American New Deal. It was a family with money, with social standing, with a public presence, but without the aristocratic elegance that the Kelly surname would acquire when its most beautiful daughter married the sovereign Prince of Monaco. Grace Kelly arrived in Hollywood in 1950, made her debut in 14 Hours in 1951, and in the 3 years that followed, built a career that would have been the envy of any actress of any generation. 11 films in total, an Academy Award for Best Actress for The Country Girl in 1955, and 3 collaborations with Alfred Hitchcock that still define today what is meant by classic cinematic glamour. Rear Window, Dial M for Murder, and To Catch a Thief are 3 of the most elegant films American cinema produced in the 20th century. And Grace Kelly is at the center of all 3. When in 1955, during the Cannes Film Festival, Paris Match organized a photo session between the most elegant American actress of the moment and the sovereign Prince of Monaco, no one imagined the session would lead to a real love story. Rainier III of the House of Grimaldi was one of the most coveted bachelors in the European aristocracy, a man who needed to marry and produce an heir with political urgency, because the treaties governing Monaco's independence stipulated that the principality would become a French protectorate if the Grimaldi line of succession were to die out. The marriage between Rainier and Grace Kelly, celebrated on April 18, 1956, with 200 accredited photographers, live television coverage for France, and representatives of 25 royal houses as witnesses, was called by the New York Times the wedding of the century. What the New York Times did not report, because those things were not published in American newspapers in the 1950s, is that Grace Kelly paid a considerable price for that marriage. The dowry that Rainier's family demanded from the Kellys was $2 million, the equivalent of about $20 million today. Grace walked away from her career at its peak. She turned down an offer from Alfred Hitchcock in 1962 to star in Marnie because Rainier and Monegasque public opinion pressured her not to return to the screen. She gave up life in America, her family, her friends, the autonomy she had as an independent actress in Hollywood, in order to become the brand image of a 200-square-kilometer principality on the French Riviera. The marriage the world saw as the perfect fairy tale had its own shadows. Rainier's infidelities were an open secret in Monaco's diplomatic and social circles, known from very shortly after the wedding. Grace was aware of them and lived with a pain that her closest friends documented in letters and memoirs. In her final years, according to the most reliable biographical accounts, she had developed a growing depression and had begun to cautiously explore the possibility of returning to film, or of separating from Rainier. Neither materialized. The last formal photograph of the complete family, Rainier, Caroline, Albert, Stephanie, and Grace, was taken on July 17, 1982, at the Beach Club of Monte Carlo. Less than 2 months later, Grace Kelly was dead. Stephanie Marie Elizabeth Grimaldi. Kelly was born on February 1, 1965, in the Prince's Palace of Monaco, the third of Rainier and Grace's 3 children. She was the cherished youngest, the baby of the family, who arrived when her siblings Caroline and Albert were already 8 and 7 years old respectively, and who for that reason received the most intense attention and the most relaxed discipline from her parents. She was baptized weeks after her birth in a cathedral, decorated with 200,000 red carnations and 30,000 white roses, the colors of the principality. From very early on, Stephanie was the one who didn't fit. Caroline was the heir, the serious one, the one who had been prepared to assume institutional responsibilities. Albert was the male heir, the future sovereign prince, the one who carried the weight of dynastic continuity. Stephanie was the little one, the rebel, the one who skipped school to be with her boyfriend, the one who provoked in her mother a mixture of despair and tenderness that Grace Kelly described in private letters with a candor her biographers found revealing. According to the English writer who published an account of the accident in Elysian magazine citing biographical documents, Grace herself had joked with friends about her youngest daughter, saying she should have raised her differently from much earlier. Grace Kelly was, in terms of symbolic capital, the greatest asset Monaco had had, or would have in the 20th century. Before her arrival, the Principality was famous primarily for its casino and its status as a tax haven for European fortunes seeking to preserve their wealth out of reach of the state. Grace Kelly turned Monaco into a global aspirational destination, the real-life version of the fairy tale the 20th century needed in the years of black and white television and illustrated paper magazines that reached every household in the Western world. The Paris Match that photographed her in the Monaco Palace in 1955 sold more copies than any previous edition. The coverage of her 1956 wedding was watched live by hundreds of millions of people. The luxury tourism she brought to Monaco in the 2 decades that followed transformed the Principality's economy in a way no fiscal instrument could have produced. The commercial value of Grace Kelly to Monaco was incalculable, and Rainier knew it. What Rainier also knew, or should have known, is that that value had a price, and someone had to pay it. The price was paid by Grace. She had to learn French as an adult. She had to study protocol, attend official events, preside over charity galas, represent a state she had arrived at as a foreigner and never entirely belonged to. She had to watch her films go unbroadcast in the Principality for years because the image of his wife as a Hollywood actress made Rainier uncomfortable. She had to decline the return to film with Hitchcock in 1962 because Monegasque public opinion held that a reigning princess should not appear on screen as what she had been before she became one. And she had to live with the discretion that protocol imposed, alongside the knowledge of her husband's infidelities, which were an open secret in the circles they frequented. In the summer of 1982, according to the most complete accounts from her biographers, Grace was exploring the possibility of retreating to the countryside, of finding some form of personal independence that could fit within the framework of her obligations as princess. Her health was not perfect. She suffered from frequent and intense headaches that her doctors were aware of. The household staff at Rock Aigle, the chauffeur and the gardener, had observed those headaches in the days before the accident and testified to it afterward. The doctors who treated her at the hospital after the accident established that the stroke that killed her was consistent with a picture of arterial hypertension and vascular damage that may have been developing over a prior period. The summer of 1982 was especially tense. Stephanie was 17 and was in what the adults around her described as uncontrollable rebellion. She had been expelled from the Lycée du Pont-Loup, the private Catholic school, in Paris where she was studying, at 16 years old. She had been involved in romances that the gossip press followed with enthusiasm and her parents observed with alarm, especially her relationship with Paul Belmondo, son of French actor Jean-Paul Belmondo, and the one she had had with Anthony Delon, son of Alain Delon. These were not relationships that a princess of Monaco should be displaying in the magazines. This was not the profile Rainier and Grace had envisioned for their youngest daughter. That summer of 1982, mother and daughter had spent several weeks together at Roccagle, the Grimaldi family's country residence high in the hills above Monaco. It was the place Grace escaped to from palace protocol, an estate with more than 15 rooms, vast gardens, pools, and 2 tennis courts where the family could behave with something approaching normality. That last week before returning to the palace, according to the chauffeur, the gardener, and the subsequent reconstruction by biographer Geoffrey Robinson in his book Rainier and Grace, was turbulent. That is Robinson's word, used based on the testimony of the staff who surrounded them. The two spent those days between reproaches and raised voices, without respite at mealtimes. Grace was trying to get Stephanie to reduce her public exposure, to focus on her studies, not to repeat the mistakes that had caused such pain in Caroline's marriage to Philippe Junot, which had ended in a noisy divorce in 1980. Stephanie had other plans. The day after the accident, she was going to Paris to begin an internship at the fashion house Dior, where she had been accepted thanks to her connections in the fashion world and her own genuine interest in design. It was her first step toward adult independence. The car was filled with her clothing, dresses on hangers, trunks, hat boxes, everything she needed for that period in Paris. The family chauffeur, who was at Roccagle that morning, had offered to drive them first and then return for the luggage. But the trunk and back seat of the Rover were completely occupied by Stephanie's belongings. There was no room for the chauffeur. Grace insisted on driving herself. This is the first element that feeds the perplexity. Because Grace Kelly, who had starred in driving scenes on the Moyenne Corniche along that exact stretch of road while filming To Catch a Thief with Cary Grant in 1955, had been in a car accident in the early 1970s that had marked her. Since that earlier accident, according to multiple testimonies gathered by her biographers, Grace made a point of avoiding driving whenever she could. That is why she had a chauffeur. That is why the chauffeur was at Roccagle that morning. And yet that morning she decided to drive. The possible reasons are several and all plausible. The car was full. The journey was short, barely 6 miles between Roccagle and the palace, though those 6 miles included some of the most dangerous curves on the Côte d'Azur. Or perhaps Grace wanted that time alone with her youngest daughter, driving as a way of continuing the conversations of the week on neutral ground. Or perhaps something more pressing was pushing her to leave early. None of these reasons have been verified. What is verified is that at 10 in the morning, on September 13th, 1982, Grace Kelly was at the wheel of the Green Rover when it left Roccagle heading for the Palace of Monaco. A gendarme who crossed paths with the car shortly after it left the estate gave his testimony later. He had recognized Princess Grace at the wheel. A truck driver traveling behind the Rover also stated he had seen her driving. 2 independent witnesses who placed Grace at the wheel in the initial stretch of the route. But then there is Sesto Lecquio. The farmer from Capdale declared to the police that when he reached the overturned car in his garden, he found the young woman on the driver's side and the older woman, unconscious, being extracted through the rear window. The contradiction is glaring. Either the gendarme and the truck driver saw Grace driving in the upper section of the road, and then there was a change of driver before the fatal curve. Or Sesto Lecquio confused the positions of the 2 passengers in the chaos of the rescue. Or Sesto Lecquio saw exactly what he stated he had seen, and what he saw was accurate. Stephanie explained the apparent contradiction years later in her first interview about the accident given to biographer Geoffrey Robinson in 1989 and published in the Chicago Tribune, then expanded in 2002 in Paris Match. Her version was as follows. She was not driving. Her door, the passenger side, had been completely destroyed in the impact and was inaccessible. With the car overturned and rolling down the embankment, both of them had bounced around inside the cabin without seatbelts, neither was wearing one, and when the car came to rest, Stephanie had ended up on the driver's side due to the combined effect of the rolls and the impacts. She got out through the only side that was accessible, which was the driver's side. And that is what Sestolequio saw. Her version has internal coherence. The car made multiple rolls down the slope. Without seatbelts, the occupants would have shifted inside the cabin. The physics of the accident make it plausible that both ended up in positions different from those they occupied at the start of the journey, but the version also has a problem. Sestolequio did not only say that the young woman was coming out through the driver's side. In his original police statement, according to what the journalist covering the accident for the UPI wire service documented in real time, Lequio said he had found Princess Grace trapped and being extracted through the rear window of the car. If Grace was extracted through the rear window, that would mean she was in the rear section of the vehicle at the moment of the final impact, not in the driver's seat. A person who is driving and loses consciousness from a stroke does not typically end up in the back seat during an accident. She ends up where she was, in the front seat. This detail is the one that for 40 years has prevented the question from closing entirely. Because if Grace was in the back seat when Lequio arrived, and Grace was the one driving, according to all the other testimony, then how did Grace get to the back seat? Through the same rolling that would have displaced Stephanie, or because Grace was never in the front seat to begin with. The element most frequently cited as evidence for the theory that Stephanie was driving is something that technically is not evidence, but an inference, that an experienced driver like Grace Kelly would not have lost control of a car on a curve she knew well, in perfect weather conditions. The day of the accident, the sky was clear, the road was dry, visibility was total. There was no objective reason for Grace Kelly, who had driven on that same road multiple times, including the chase scene from To Catch a Thief she filmed along that exact stretch in 1955, to lose control in those conditions, unless something inside her body had failed suddenly. The pre-impact stroke explains exactly that. But the question some raise is why the stroke did not activate any braking response. Medical theory holds that a stroke affecting certain areas of the brain can produce a muscle contracture that causes the leg to press the accelerator rather than move toward the brake. That would explain the absence of brake lights the truck driver reported, and would also explain the progressive acceleration of the vehicle the same witness described. The car did not slow down. The car accelerated toward the curve. That is not what a frightened driver trying to brake does. It is what a vehicle does when the person at the wheel no longer controls their own extremities. There is an additional detail that rarely appears in popular accounts of the accident, and that comes directly from Stephanie's testimony to biographer Robinson. Stephanie said that her mother complained of a headache during the journey, that at one point she appeared to faint for a second, that the car began to veer at that moment, that her mother opened her eyes quickly, but it was already too late. That account, if accurate, describes the clinical picture of a stroke in real time, a moment of loss of consciousness, a partial recovery, and then the inability to regain control of the vehicle before impact. It is also the account of someone who was watching what was happening, not of someone who was at the wheel. Commander Roger W. Benxe, the officer who led the accident investigation for the relevant authorities, offered years later the most categorical version of all. Biographer Bertrand Tessier published his interview with Benxe, for a long time the most cited testimony by those defending the official version. Benxe's words were unambiguous. It was clear that the person who had driven the vehicle throughout the entire journey, as they had been able to reconstruct the events, had been Princess Grace, and this was confirmed by the fact that Stephanie was rescued from the passenger's side. One must pause on that last sentence. Commander Benxe said that Stephanie was rescued from the passenger's side. That directly contradicts what Sestolequio stated. Who is right? The farmer who arrived first and testified on the spot, or the investigating officer who reconstructed the events days later with more information available? The two versions cannot be simultaneously correct. Either Stephanie was pulled out through the driver's side, as Lequio said, or through the passenger's side, as Benxe said. And that contradiction between the two most direct testimonies of the accident is the crack through which doubt has survived for more than 4 decades. Stephanie herself added another element to the reconstruction that generates yet another question without a comfortable answer. In her statements to Paris Match in 2002, 20 years after the accident, she said, "The investigation noted that the automatic gearbox was in the park position. Since I was about to take my driving test, I knew you had to put the lever in park to stop the car. I tried everything. I even pulled the handbrake. Did my mother confuse the brake pedal with the accelerator? I don't know, but I was not driving." That statement contains something her defenders point to as proof of innocence, and her critics point to as something equally revealing. Stephanie knows the automatic transmission was in park. She knows she put the lever in park. She knows she pulled the handbrake. All of those are actions of someone actively trying to stop the car from the passenger seat. Or they are the actions of someone who was at the wheel, and in the moment of panic tried everything. They knew. Both readings are possible. What the truck driver travelling behind the Rover contributed is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. He said that what struck him was not the speed or the trajectory of the car in the meters before the curve. What struck him was that at no point, not at the curve, not when the car left the road, did the rear brake lights come on. There was no braking. The car made no attempt to stop. It simply accelerated toward the void. That is consistent with the hypothesis of a stroke that paralyzed the driver's leg onto the accelerator. It is also consistent with the hypothesis of an inexperienced driver who in the moment of panic confused the pedals. The physics of the accident do not distinguish between the two possibilities. The doctors who treated Grace at the hospital that bore her name, the Centre Hospitalier Princess Grace of Monaco, determined that she had suffered two distinct cerebral hemorrhages. The first, a minor stroke, had occurred before the impact, while she was driving. It was that first stroke that caused her to lose control of the vehicle. The second hemorrhage, far more severe, was the direct consequence of the cranial trauma produced by the accident. The combination of the two injuries was incompatible with survival. On the morning of September 14, 1982, the doctors determined that Grace was brain dead. Rainier and his 3 children made the decision to disconnect her from mechanical support. Grace Kelly died at 52 years old. Stephanie could not attend the funeral. She was still hospitalized with a fractured cervical vertebra, fractured clavicle, and multiple broken ribs. She watched her mother buried in the Cathedral of St. Nicholas in Monaco, the same one where Grace had married Rainier 26 years earlier, through a television screen from her hospital bed. It was September 18, 1982. Stephanie was 17 years old. That same day, while the entire world broadcast images of the funeral, attended by Princess Diana, First Lady Nancy Reagan, and Cary Grant, Grace's closest friend, the rumors circulating in newsrooms and in Monaco's salons were already taking the shape they would hold for the decades to come. It was the young one who was driving. It was said that Grace had been behind the wheel, because Stephanie was 17 and had no license. A witness said he had seen her pass by at the wheel. The Monaco consulate in New York issued a formal statement on September 15, 1982, the day after Grace's death, denying French reports suggesting that Stephanie had been driving. Princess Stephanie was the passenger in the car, driven by Princess Grace, and was not driving at the time of the accident. There is a witness who states that Princess Stephanie was removed from the passenger seat. The official denial came within 48 hours of the accident, before the investigation was complete, and that itself became an argument for the skeptics that no one issues a denial that quickly and that forcefully about something that is completely false, unless they fear that the truth might be formally established and need the official version in place before that happens. The cover-up argument has circulated for decades in various forms. The most articulate version was offered by retired French judge Jacques Bidalou, who spent 2 years and his own money investigating the accident and made public statements reproduced by outlets specializing in the Grimaldi family's history. Bidalou noted that the car was covered with plastic sheeting immediately after the accident, preventing photographers from getting close. That the police photographers and accident experts had no opportunity to examine the vehicle and its trajectory at the scene. That the car was removed from the scene in less than half an hour. That the accident occurred on French territory, but the victim was taken to the Monaco hospital rather than to the hospitals in Nice, far better equipped to treat serious brain injuries, and that no autopsy was ever performed. The argument about the absence of an autopsy is indeed documentable. No autopsy was performed on Grace Kelly's body. Rainier, in his capacity as sovereign of Monaco, had the authority to prevent that procedure, and according to all available accounts, He did. The doctors who treated her issued their conclusions based on analyses carried out while she was alive. The absence of an autopsy proves nothing, but it eliminates forever the possibility that any medical conclusion can be completely definitive. If Stephanie had been driving, the consequences would have been multiple and grave. She was a minor. She had no driver's license. In France, where the accident technically occurred, because the road is French, even though it lies in the immediate vicinity of Monaco, driving without a license as a minor is a criminal offence. The Grimaldi family would have faced legal proceedings that would have contaminated the public mourning with a judicial dimension. And the image of the monarchical institution, which depended heavily on the symbolic capital of Grace Kelly as its most internationally recognized face, would have suffered additional damage at the worst possible moment. Those who defend the theory that Stephanie was driving and that there was a cover-up point to all of those elements as sufficient motive for the family and the Monegasque government to prefer the version of Grace suffering a stroke at the wheel. A mother who dies in an accident caused by her own illness is a tragedy. A teenage girl with no license driving at 60 miles per hour along one of the most dangerous roads on the Riviera and killing her mother is a scandal. Those who defend the official version and Stephanie's innocence point out that the two most direct witnesses who observed the beginning of the journey, the gendarme and the truck driver, both saw Grace driving. That Commander Bentz's investigation determined that Grace drove throughout, that the mechanics of the accident are completely consistent with a sudden stroke, that the car's brakes were inspected and found to be in good condition, ruling out mechanical failure, and that Stephanie has consistently denied being at the wheel for more than 4 decades, in different interviews, in different contexts, with different levels of detail, without fundamental contradictions between the various versions. What no one disputes is what the accident did to Stephanie. The question of who was driving settled in the public mind with the speed and permanence of accusations that don't need proof to function. Stephanie was young, she was rebellious, she was the enfant terrible of the Grimaldi family. The narrative that she had been at the wheel fit perfectly with the character the press had constructed. The fact that there was no direct proof didn't matter, because rumor doesn't need proof. It only needs coherence with a pre-existing narrative. The wound the accident left on Stephanie's psychology is documentable through the trajectory her life took afterward. Psychologists who have worked with victims of severe trauma recognize in Stephanie's subsequent behavior patterns consistent with someone who has suffered unprocessed trauma. The compulsive search for intense experiences, the inability to establish lasting relationships, the rejection of authority structures, the need to prove to herself and the world that she is still alive. This is not a diagnosis, because no psychologist without direct access to the person can make diagnoses. It is the observation of those who have studied her history and compared it with known patterns. What Stephanie has said about her own chaotic years, in the few interviews where she has spoken with any depth about them, is not that she was running away. It is that she was searching for an identity that was neither Grace Kelly's daughter, nor the Princess of Monaco, nor the girl who was in the car that day. Something of her own, something that belonged to her regardless of everything that had happened before. The pop singer was an identity of her own. The swimwear designer was an identity of her own. Even the circus artist in a 14-meter caravan was an identity of her own. None of them were what was expected of Grace Kelly's daughter. And that was precisely the point. The relationships with the bodyguards, which the press presented as eccentricity or provocation, also have a different reading in context. Daniel Ducrouet was the man assigned to protect her. Jean-Raymond Gottlieb was the man whose function was to keep her safe. The 1982 accident had happened at a moment when no one was protecting her, when her mother, the person who should have protected her, had not been able to. That Stephanie developed deep emotional bonds with the people whose function was to protect her requires no elaborate psychological theory to understand. It requires only remembering what had happened to her. Everyone said I had been driving the car, that it was all my fault, and that I had killed my mother. It's not easy to live with that when you're 17. That is what Stephanie told the Chicago Tribune years later. She had to receive psychological help to deal with the trauma of losing her mother and the additional weight of public guilt imposed on her from outside. She was an adolescent who had lost her mother, whose own body was fractured, who had not been able to attend the funeral, and who, on top of all of that, was being publicly pointed to as responsible for that death. The rebellion that defined Stephanie's following years cannot be understood without that context. It was not simply the behavior of a capricious princess who didn't want to fulfill her obligations. It was the response of someone who had received from the world a very clear signal that the world considered her guilty of the worst thing that had ever happened to her. When the world tells you that at 17, the options are few and none are simple. Stephanie chose to live outwardly, with an intensity that permanently defied expectations. First came the world of fashion. In 1983, physically recovered from the accident, she began the Dior internship that had been the destination of that fateful journey. In 1984, she appeared in the fashion pages of European magazines as a model. In 1986, she launched her own swimwear line, Pool Position, with Alix de la Comble, a collaborator she had met during her Dior internship. The collection was presented at the Monte Carlo Sporting Club before her father, her siblings, and the international press. That same year, 1986, Stephanie released her first single on the French label Carrère, produced by Yves Roset. The song was called Ouragan in French, meaning hurricane, and Irresistible in English. It sold more than 2 million copies in France alone, becoming one of the best-selling singles of all time in the country. The English version entered the top 10 in the United States. The complete album, released in various countries as Besoin or simply Stephanie, sold more than 1.5 million copies, with 100,000 in France alone. A 21-year-old princess had just become an international pop star. What the gossip press never forgave was that the lyrics of her songs and her music videos, with the leotards, the defined shoulders, the studded leather, and the punk pop aesthetic, seemed specifically designed to challenge everything expected of Grace Kelly's daughter. Hitchcock's muse had embodied the most refined classical elegance. Her youngest daughter chose the brazenness of the 80s, androgyny, athletic sensuality, the image of someone who owes nothing to anyone and does exactly as she pleases. The Independent of London described her at that time as having the physique of her sister Caroline, but with steroids, the appearance of a male model before male models started looking like boys. The music career did not last. The second album had disappointing sales. The third, recorded in Los Angeles in 1991 and released after 5 years of work, was received with negative reviews, despite a promotional tour that included an appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show. What did endure, though uncredited for years, was her participation as mystery girl on Michael Jackson's song, In the Closet, included on the Dangerous album of 1991. The song was a worldwide hit that entered the top 10 in the United States. Stephanie recorded the main vocal lines of the track, but her name did not appear in the original credits. The story of her participation was not publicly confirmed until several years later. Between the music, the design, and the spotlight, Stephanie's love life generated headlines with a regularity that exhausted even the journalists. Specializing in the Monegasque royal family, Paul Belmondo, son of actor Jean-Paul Belmondo, whom she had already been seeing before the accident, and whose relationship with her had been one of the points of tension with her mother, Anthony Delon, son of Alain Delon. Rob Loeb, the American actor at the peak of his fame in the 80s, with whom she maintained a relationship that generated speculation on both sides of the Atlantic. Mario Oliver Joutard, a Frenchman who had worked as a waiter and who in 1981 had been accused of raping a 19-year-old woman, though he denied the charges and was ultimately convicted of a lesser offence. Rainier was firmly opposed to that relationship. Stephanie maintained it for 2 years. And then came Daniel Ducrouet. Ducrouet had been born in Beausoleil in 1964, the son of a manual labourer. He had studied 1 year at the University of Nice before dropping out. He had worked as a bodybuilder, as a clerk in a pet store, and as a fishmonger before being admitted as a Monaco police officer in 1986. In 1991, he was assigned as Stephanie's personal bodyguard during a tour to promote her album. The relationship that developed in that context was exactly the kind Rainier had feared since his daughter started having boyfriends. Ducrouet was not entirely free when the relationship with Stephanie became public. His former girlfriend was 6 months pregnant with his child when the story broke. The son, born shortly afterward, was named Michael. Rainier initially refused to give his blessing to the relationship. his daughter's pressure, culminating in May 1992, when she announced she was pregnant with their first child together, produced a temporary rupture between father and daughter that the European tabloids covered as if it were a diplomatic crisis. Louis Robert Paul Ducrouet was born in 1992. Pauline Grace Maggie Ducrouet in 1994. Both children were born outside of marriage because Rainier had not approved the wedding. Under Monegasque law, they were illegitimate children, excluded from the line of succession to the throne. Only when the prince finally relented, influenced, according to several sources, by the open-heart bypass surgery he underwent in 1994, which caused him to view the family situation from a different perspective, did the wedding become possible. Daniel Ducrouet and Princess Stephanie of Monaco were married on July 1, 1995, at the Monaco Town Hall. With the marriage, Louis and Pauline entered the line of succession. The marriage lasted 1 year and 3 months. In September 1996, the Italian magazine Eva Tremila published photographs of Ducrouet at a villa on the Côte d'Azur with a 26-year-old woman named Muriel Mol-Houteman, known for having won the Miss Bare Breasts of Belgium contest in 1995. The images were explicit. In addition to the photographs, there was a 90-minute video. Ducrouet claimed he had been the victim of a setup, that Mol-Houteman had drugged his champagne, and that the session had been arranged by the photographer for extortion purposes. The subsequent investigation would partly vindicate him. Mol-Houteman received a 6-month suspended sentence, and the photographer and his assistant received 1 year suspended sentences. Ducrouet fled to Morocco when the scandal broke. The divorce was finalized on October 4, 1996. On July 15, 1998, Stephanie gave birth to a daughter at the Centre Hospitalier Princess Grace of Monaco. The girl was named Camille Marie Kelly Gottlieb, with the Kelly in honor of her grandmother. On the birth certificate, the space designated for the father's name was left blank. Stephanie refused to formally declare the father's identity. Rumors pointed to Jean-Raymond Gottlieb, her former head of security, who shared the surname with the child. Gottlieb acknowledged his paternity years later, but was never part of the official family nucleus. Camille, not being the daughter of a recognized marriage, was excluded from the line of succession to the throne of Monaco. Rainier III revised his will after the Ducrouet scandal and the string of relationships that followed. According to journalistic accounts of the time, the prince established that Stephanie would receive 20 million euros from the 4 billion that constituted the Grimaldi family's estimated fortune. Her siblings, Caroline and Albert, would inherit the rest. The difference in testamentary treatment reflected the difference in institutional regard. Caroline and Albert had met the expectations of the crown. Stephanie had not. What came next continued to make news, but differently. In 2001, Stephanie began a relationship with Franco Canaille, the owner of Circus Canaille, one of the most important circus shows in Europe, who was married at the time. She moved with her 3 children into the 14-meter caravan that Kenny himself equipped with heating, a refrigerator, air conditioning and hot water, and which they ironically christened the Palace. She travelled with the circus across Europe for more than a year. Images of Stephanie washing dishes, cleaning windows, and doing household chores in her caravan, while her children played outside among the circus animals, went around the world. They were the perfect portrait of a princess who had chosen to live completely outside the system that had produced her. In 2003, in a small Swiss town, she secretly married Adans Lopez Perez, a Portuguese acrobat of Spanish origin, 10 years her junior, whom she had met in Circus Canaille. The wedding was so discreet that even the outlets obsessively covering the Grimaldi family discovered it late. Stephanie arrived at the ceremony in sneakers, a white t-shirt and jeans. Rainier met his new son-in-law, a clown named Salvador, who was Adams's father, when there was nothing he could do to prevent it. The divorce came in November 2004, less than 14 months after the wedding. Rainier III died on April 15, 2005. He was 81 years old. He had outlived his wife by 22 years and had never remarried, though there were rumors of a failed marriage proposal to aristocrat Ira von Fürstenberg in 1992. Stephanie was at his side in his final months. Her father's death was, as she herself has said in her rare subsequent interviews, the second great turning point of her life, after the 1982 accident. Since then, Stephanie of Monaco has slowly built a different public identity. In 2003, she founded the Association of Women Against AIDS, which in 2004 became Fight AIDS Monaco. The foundation grew from a personal experience. A friend of hers was HIV positive, had been left alone with a child, and no resources or institutional support, and Stephanie could find nothing available to help her. Since 2006, she has been a Goodwill Ambassador for UNAIDS, the joint United Nations program on HIV and AIDS. She organizes galas, concerts, auctions, and events to fund the foundation. It is probably the most sustained and consistent cause of her entire adult life. On February 1st, 2015, when she turned 50, Stephanie gave an interview in which she said something that summarizes her existence with considerable precision. "I have lived several lives in one. I like life with everything it brings me, and I make the most of every moment, whether it ends well or badly. No regrets." There is a dimension of the accident that is rarely analyzed with the attention it deserves, having to do with the specific context of that week. The family chauffeur, who knew Grace Kelly's driving habits better than anyone, stated after the accident that the princess had been suffering from acute headaches that paralyzed her in the days before, that those headaches were recurring and intense enough for both him and the gardener to notice. That adds an element to the chronology that changes something in how we read the whole picture. It was not simply that Grace had a sudden stroke on an ordinary day. It was that Grace had already been showing symptoms for days that in retrospect are consistent with the vascular picture that killed her. If Grace had symptoms that week and still chose to drive that morning, that suggests the decision to drive was genuinely hers, and that she did not make it because she felt well, but because in that particular moment, with the car full of Stephanie's clothes and the chauffeur waiting, she judged the journey short enough to manage. That kind of decision, the kind made by someone who has been unwell for days and decides to do one more thing before resting, is completely human, and it is completely independent of who was sitting in the passenger seat. There is an additional element of the story that connects the 1982 accident with the broader question of what kind of mother Grace Kelly was, and what kind of daughter Stephanie was. The conflict of that last week at Rockagle was not a minor disagreement between a capricious adolescent and a strict mother. It was the conflict between two people who loved each other and could not find a way to understand each other about something essential: how much freedom Stephanie deserved and under what conditions. Grace had seen how a lack of discretion destroyed marriages within her own family. She had lived through the scandal of Caroline's marriage and divorce from Philippe Junot with a pain that her close friends described as devastating. She did not want the same for Stephanie. Stephanie was 17 years old, and what she wanted was to live. Both reasons are completely valid. Both reasons are incompatible. And both people died, or nearly died, before being able to resolve that incompatibility. The argument of those who maintain there was a cover-up finds its greatest difficulty in a practical question. How many people would have had to stay silent for that cover-up to hold for 40 years? The investigating officer Benzer, the doctors who treated Grace, the doctors who treated Stephanie, the hospital staff, the police who arrived at the scene, the forensic technicians, the Monegasque government officials. For a cover-up of that scale to hold for 4 decades without any of those involved leaking it, all of them would have had to maintain the same secret with the same determination throughout. That is not impossible, but it is improbable at the scale it would require. What is true is that the accident scene was managed with a speed that surprised some observers. The car was covered and removed in less than half an hour. The formal investigation did not produce a comprehensive public report. That can be evidence of deliberate cover-up, or it can simply be the result of Monaco's government, a small sovereign state with its own norms and its own protocol, managing a tragedy that directly affected the reigning prince's family with the discretion it deemed appropriate. Both interpretations are compatible with the known facts. The question of who was driving the Moyenne Corniche on September 13, 1982, remains without a definitive answer. Not because the facts are necessarily obscure, but because the mechanisms that would have allowed it to be established with rigor, the autopsy, the forensic examination of the vehicle at the scene, the formal analysis of both occupants' positions, were never executed with the necessary independence and time. What remained was the contradictory testimony of Sesto Lecquio and Commander Bense, Stephanie's official statement that she was not driving, and the word of the gendarme and the truck driver that they had indeed seen Grace at the wheel in the initial stretch. The medical version is the most solid of all those available. The doctors determined that Grace suffered a stroke before the impact, a sudden stroke that paralyzes a driver onto the accelerator while she is navigating a mountain curve. Excessive speed produces exactly the type of accident that occurred. No braking, no trajectory correction, with acceleration through impact. The physics of the accident fit that explanation in a way that no other version fits comparably. That does not prove Stephanie was not driving, because the same physics would function if the person who collapsed was the passenger, and the one paralyzed by panic was the inexperienced driver. But it does make the cover-up hypothesis unnecessary to explain what happened. What no medical report can retroactively determine is what occurred inside the car during the final seconds before the curve. Whether there was an argument that distracted the driver, whether someone tried to intervene with the steering wheel, whether there was any change of position between the two occupants at any point during the journey. Those seconds will remain forever, without witness or document. Stephanie of Monaco is 61 years old today. She has 2 grandchildren, Victoire, born in April 2023, and Constance, born in December 2024, daughters of her son Louis and his wife Marie. In 2025, in an interview with Point de Vue, she announced her intention to retire from regular public appearances, though not from her AIDS activism. Her words were, "I no longer see the point of talking about myself. I'm 60. I feel I've given enough and said everything I had to say." What she has not said, what she will in all likelihood never say, in a way that closes the debate, is everything she knows exactly about what happened inside that green rover during the final minutes of September 13th, 1982. If indeed she knows anything more than she has told, if there is anything more to tell. The question will keep circulating, in biographies, in documentaries, in anniversary articles, in conversations among those fascinated by the story of Europe's most glamorous family. It will keep circulating, because it is precisely the kind of question that stories of power and tragedy produce, and that never fully close. Not because the answer is necessarily different from the official version, but because the mechanisms that could have established it irrefutably were discarded. And once that happens, the space they leave is occupied by doubt, forever. The Moyenne Corniche is still there. The curve where the car plunged over the embankment remains exactly as dangerous as it was in 1982. And the question of who was driving that morning, 43 years later, remains the question that defines Stephanie of Monaco in the world's memory, with more persistence than any pop record, any swimwear line, any relationship, any marriage, any life in a circus caravan, any act of philanthropy. That is the deepest injustice of the entire story. Not that she was accused without sufficient evidence, but that 40 years of a life of her own have not been enough for the world to stop defining her by what occurred during a few seconds when she was 17 years old. There is a final irony in the whole story of Stephanie of Monaco that deserves to be named. The journey that ended in the accident was the outbound journey, toward the beginning of Stephanie's adult life. She was going to start her Dior internship the next day. She was going to live in Paris for the first time on her own, away from the palace, away from her mother, with the independence she had been asking for years. The car was full of her clothes because everything she needed for that first chapter of her independent life was in that car. And it was precisely that clothing, the luggage of the beginning of her freedom, that filled the back seat of the Rover and left no room for the chauffeur who could have driven. If the chauffeur had driven, Grace Kelly would have arrived at the palace. Stephanie would have taken the train to Paris the next day. And in all probability, no one outside Monaco would today remember the name Stephanie of Monaco with the intensity with which it is remembered. The fate of people who live inside great families sometimes depends on details that no plan can anticipate. The quantity of clothes that fit in a back seat, a mother's decision to drive a short journey herself, a curve that bears the name of the Devil's Corniche. The fact that Michael Jackson's in the closet, that single that entered the top 10 in the United States with Stephanie as the mysterious female voice under the alias Mystery Girl, is today remembered primarily as a curiosity in the musical archive of the 90s, says something significant about how the question of who was driving has absorbed everything else. Stephanie participated in one of the best-selling albums in the history of 20th century popular music. That should be a central part of her story. It is not. What is central to her story is what happened on that road when she was 17 years old. That distortion, a long and complex life permanently reduced to a moment in adolescence, is perhaps the greatest damage the accident caused her. Not the fractured cervical vertebra, the fractured clavicle, the broken ribs from which she physically recovered in months, but the fracture of public identity that never fully healed. The rebellious princess, the label the gossip press attached to her in the 80s and still uses today, does not describe the woman who in 2010 opened the House of Life in Carpentras to provide psychological and material support to people living with HIV. It does not describe the woman who in 2013 intervened to save elephants that the Lion Zoo was going to euthanize. It does not describe the UNAIDS Goodwill Ambassador who since 2006 has carried the HIV/AIDS cause to international forums. It describes the adolescent who survived an accident that killed her mother, and whom the world decided should carry that burden forever. At 61 years old, in 2026, Stephanie of Monaco is the grandmother of 2 little girls, Victoire and Constance, and lives in Monaco with the discretion she chose years ago. She no longer gives interviews. She no longer poses for photographs regularly. She goes to the supermarket dressed casually, like any other Monegasque. She presides over the Monte Carlo International Circus Festival, the cause that unites her love of that world with her father's legacy, as it was Rainier who instituted the festival and turned it into one of the most important in the world, and she continues to preside over Fight AIDS Monaco, because that cause is one she cannot delegate. "I have lived several lives in one," she said in 2015. "No regrets." It is a declaration that can be read as peace achieved with difficulty, or as the only possible way to survive everything that has happened to her. It is probably both things simultaneously. And the question of who was driving on September 13th, 1982, will probably remain part of every introduction anyone gives of her, every headline that covers anything she does, every anniversary article published when the 50th year of the accident arrives in 2032. Because that question does not belong to Stephanie. It belongs to the world that decided to ask it, and has never been willing to let it go. If this story has stayed with you, if at any point you found yourself thinking about what it means to carry for decades a question the world has no intention of withdrawing, leave your thoughts in the comments. This story does not have a single possible reading. And if you want to know more about the secrets of Europe's royal families, about the tragedies that no protocol could prevent, and about the women who survived what should have destroyed them, this channel has the stories of Letizia Ortiz, the Romanov sisters, and Joan Kennedy. Power and glamour always have their price. Subscribe. The next story is already on its way.